Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. My name is Keith Bybee, and I direct the Institute for the Study of Judiciary, Politics, and the Media here at Syracuse University. IJPM, as we call ourselves, is a collaboration between the College of Law, the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs, and the Newhouse School of Public Communications. This semester we're hosting a lecture series on law, politics, and the media, and today we have the fourth lecture in that series. The lecture series is part of an interdisciplinary course called Law, Politics, and the Media that is based at the College of Law but cross-listed at Maxwell and Newhouse. And that course itself is part of a certificate program on law, politics, and the media. This semester we've already heard from a variety of speakers, including Justice Harold C., who is just stepped down from the Alabama State Supreme Court and is a vocal advocate of judicial elections. Today we have Bert Brandenburg, who is Executive Director of Justice at Stake, and he will also be speaking about judicial elections today in his lecture. The title of his lecture is Judicial Elections Through the Eyes and Ears of the Voter. Those of you who had an opportunity to hear Justice C. speak, I think will find some interesting contrasts with the point of view taken by Bert Brandenburg. Mr. Brandenburg has been Director of Justice at Stake now for 5 years, five wonderful years. Justice at Stake is a nonpartisan organization that has affiliates and partners all around the country, both at local and state level and national level, that works to keep courts fair and impartial. As they put it, their goal is to keep politics and special interests out of the courtroom so that judges can do their job of protecting the Constitution, citizens' rights, and the rule of law. Justice at Stake is funded by a variety of foundations, including the Open Society Institute and the Carnegie Corporation. The Carnegie Corporation is a co-sponsor of the course associated with this lecture series, as is the Carnegie Legal Reporting Program, which is based in Newhouse, which is a partner with IJPM on many of our initiatives, including this lecture series and this course. Before Mr. Brandenburg took the helm at Justice at Stake, he had a variety of experiences in national government, and perhaps most relevant to what he's doing now, he was Director of Public Affairs and Chief Spokesperson for the Attorney General, Janet Reno, at the Department of Justice. Today, the lecture will go for roughly an hour or so, and I believe that the opportunities for a question and answer will exist throughout the lecture. At 5 o'clock, we will conclude the lecture and reconvene outside for a small reception. Please join me in welcoming Bert Brandenburg.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon. And it's a great honor to be here. And I think you have a terrific program running. I've been in touch with Keith and Mark about it over the years, and always been impressed by afar. It's just really an honor to actually be in the room with you and be part of it. And I have some sense of the diversity of people here from the various programs. And I'll just say that I, too, as a law student, sought havens from the world of pure torts and contracts and property, and these were some of my favorite courses, those that had a chance to mix things up. And I have vivid memories of my Roman law class, which was not on the bar exam, and we took it on Friday evenings, on Saturday mornings, and we were sitting there with our Diet Cokes and the readings we really hadn't done, and listening to the lecturer, who was this incredibly distinguished Austrian professor who was known as a world-renowned expert on Austrian law. And he had classes where he would have 500 people start the class and 300 finished. This is how hard the students had to work. You had to literally survive. And there we were with our slim reading, not even having done it. And I felt bad about this for a little while. And then I realized, he's coming over to the U.S. for 6 weeks and just has to work one night and one morning and gets the rest of the week to himself. He's probably doing okay too. So I want to have a conversation, and this will be kind of a combination of kind of suggestion and questions and thoughts. And we're going to look at law and politics and policy. And I want to try to help everyone, the people of you who become attorneys and maybe judges, especially the reporters in the House here. And just as citizens, I think these topics are pretty important. And I hope you'll agree with me more by the time we finish up here. I'm actually not going to try to get into any repetition of the debate over whether or not to elect judges. I know that you discussed that a couple weeks ago with Justice C. I was actually able to watch a little bit of that on the internet and saw some of his remarks. And he, of course, did a terrific job. And it is, to be fair, for most of us, a fairly inside baseball debate, focused on conceptual issues like the Constitution and federalism and jurisprudence, all very important. And I should add that my organization has no particular position on whether or not judges should be elected. We have many disagreements within our own House. But what I'm going to do instead today, in some ways to kind of complement Justice C's approach, is talk a little bit more about what we see as the real world of judicial elections. And there are a lot of people who invoke the voters in their arguments, and I think that when you look at judicial elections through the eyes of the voters and what they actually encounter, I'm hoping you'll gain new perspective on this larger debate of how to best pick judges, but also thinking about the courts themselves. So my larger goal is really to examine many of these larger themes through the eyes and ears of judicial election voters. It will be a mixture of question and suggestion. We will also get to watch TV for a few minutes as well. I'm going to talk about judicial elections and what they are, a little bit about voting patterns and turnout in judicial elections, sources of information for voters, some of the consequences of the turnout patterns we see, which are low turnout, and then want to get into a discussion about how to improve turnout. And in some ways I want to use you all as a focus group, and I'm not saying this as a cheap trick that I'm going to have, having gotten out of preparing an actual lecture, because I have plenty to say here, and say, oh, what do you think, or anything like that. This topic is about what it takes to get voters involved in judicial elections, and I think that thinking like a voter is the only way to approach this. And so while I'll cover many topics getting there, in some ways my most important end goal is to help you help me deal with the challenge we face, which is what would work best to lure more voters into judicial elections. What role do the institutions of law and media and public policy play in that challenge? And what would make these votes as educated as possible? I'm essentially appointing you this evening or this afternoon to a commission to increase turnout in judicial elections, and you will not be paid. And I want to start with a question. Actually, for a number of these topics, what I want to do is at times kind of call on you, and I would just say that as a veteran back row person from law students, I appreciate that there are a few people in the front row, though I also appreciate you didn't have a choice. The back row filled first. I was here early. The only reason I started wearing glasses was because if I had not, I would have had to move down in the front row in law school. So I want to actually start with a question that anybody is free to chime in on, which is, before we get to the issue of elections and voters, et cetera, what values do we want from our judges? And, I just need a word or two, not necessarily a long answer. Does anybody have kind of a first thing that springs to mind? What value do I want from a judge? Anyone?
Honesty.
Sir? Honesty. I will repeat some of these answers because I know we're on video. Other answers?
Impartiality.
Impartiality. Anything else? These are two good ones, so no wrong answers here.
Integrity.
Integrity, good.
Knowledge of the law.
Very good. Anything else? Let me throw out, these are all very good answers. Let me throw out a couple of others that one often hears. Someone said impartiality, fairness, very connected to that, often comes up quite a bit. And also accountability. Does that ring a bell? And in particular, to whom you're accountable. And we talk sometimes about being accountable to the law and the Constitution. These are all values, and you've really named them, that the public very much definitely wants from their judiciary. And I guess I want to ask a sort of fairly obvious question, is thinking for a second about the values that you want judges to have, are there any immediate contrasts you see between those values and the values that you want your legislators to have as good public office holders? And let's assume that they're honest, and that the honesty and the integrity part is taken care of. Are there contrasts nonetheless, even if everybody's doing their job well, that anybody wants to draw between the job of a judge and the job of a legislator? And let's say they're both elected. Anybody? I'm sorry.
I would just say a lot of times would support legislators who are progressive.
Uh-huh.
But
So-
I guess I would support judges who are progressive too.
Yeah.
But you don't usually think of it in the same way. So.
Well, it's interesting way you said that. And you had something?
I was going to say that you probably won't find very many impartial
Mhm.
legislators.
So let me crystallize this another way and see if you agree with this. Would it be fair to say that it's the job of a legislator to make a promise and keep a promise, perhaps a progressive promise or whatever promise you want them to make? And if that's the case, is that quite the job of a judge? I don't want this to sound too leading, but this kind of gets you the way we've looked at the world, and I would say that, again, I am sort of tracking what we do see most Americans saying, and that is the contrast we see, that the public does absolutely want legislators to make promises and keep them, cut your taxes, increase your health care. When it gets to the world of judges, I would say it gets more complicated. You can't say that's absolutely not the case. On the other hand, people pretty quickly will tell you, I'm not sure I want a judge promising in advance how they're going to decide a case before they've had the litigants appear in court, before I've had my chance to make my argument. Do I really want a judge to have committed him or herself in advance? This gets the issue of what judicial elections are, and let me just ask you, I'm presuming you're from some number of states around the country, how many of you just know whether or not your state elects judges? I'm seeing about, I'm going to guess, half of hands, maybe a little bit less than half of hands. That's a better percentage than most people. It's not a topic that people focus on, and indeed, a lot of you may not be sure, not just because you don't necessarily hear about this stuff, but because it's a real patchwork around the country, and in fact, it's often a patchwork within the states, so that it is quite typical that you'll see states electing judges at one level, doing a different system for a second level, and maybe even a third system of appointment or something at the trial level, or various mixtures. New York State has such a mixture on its own. All told around the nation, something like 87-89% of all judges have to stand for election. State judges in America have to stand for election. Now, I should say that's pretty much all the judges in America. 98% of all cases are decided by state judges. The federal bench gets the glamour. They have about 1,000 judges or so. They're dwarfed by their state cousins, and the vast majority of whom, as I was mentioning, stand for election. And there are essentially two types we're thinking about here, and both will play a role in what I'm talking about today. There are contested elections and retention elections, and I know Justice C got into this a little bit last time, but let me just clarify what the terms are. When I talk about a contested election, that is a classic you versus me election. You run, one of you is going to win, the other is going to lose. You run against each other. A retention election is a little bit different. A retention election is where the incumbent judge stands alone on the ballot. You either decide to keep that judge or fire the judge. So if more than 50% of the voters say, let's keep the judge, they're kept. Some states actually use different thresholds to fire a judge. Some say you can fire a judge after 50%. Some say let's make it 55 or 60. These are usually appendages of these merit retention systems whereby you have a screening committee in the front that helps pick out, hopefully, a slate of good judges for the governor to pick from. But the point with the election is that's the part at the back end. And that's the part where a judge stands alone and is either, like I said, kept or fired. So when we get into then the voting patterns in these judicial elections that exist all across America, let me just ask you, how many of you generally vote? Just period. Glad to see, I think, every hand up. How many of you have voted for a judge before? Good number. Good number, including some of you who didn't have an initial answer as to whether your state votes for judges. I'll take that. And of the things to remember, I think that's better. How many of you have gone to the ballot box, as clearly here, and skipped over the judges when you got to them? I see one, two. Okay, I see a number of hands. You all are fairly typical, too, of a trend called roll-off. And this is where voters cast votes for offices at the top of the ballot, like president or governor, and they get to other offices lower down the ballot and they stop. And this has been studied to some extent by political scientists. Let me just say it's particularly strong in judicial elections. And you saw, I think, some statistics in the reading materials you were given for this lecture. One of them you could throw out is between 1980 and 1995. About 1/4 of those who went to the polls skipped voting for a Supreme Court seat. I would just say I think there are examples where it's even larger. And particularly for lower level judgeships, this lack of interest can be even more pronounced. We've seen judicial elections where voter turnout is close to 13% or even lower in terms of who even participates. And let me just ask you, a few of you described yourself as roll-off voters, Any one of you want to just explain to me why, when you got to the judges on the ballot, as good voters, you stopped? Sir?
Just not informed enough to make a honest decision.
Yep, yep. And that is usually the answer that people provide when they're asked about this very question. This is what most people say, and indeed our organization did focus groups where beyond the polling, we simply asked people, we really got into it, and they actually said something beyond the fact that they didn't have enough information. They said, you were kind of getting at this, we think we would be irresponsible citizens if we voted and didn't have information. We think we're being good citizens by not voting when we get to the ballot box and we vote for other offices but not for judges. Getting to issues that cause this roll-off and this diminishment of media and voter interest, let me just ask, anybody have any experience, particularly amongst you media-savvy types here, with media coverage of judicial elections? Anybody recall any media coverage of a judicial election? I'm seeing no hands whatsoever. Let me just say this is one of the major factors out there that diminishes voter interest, the fact that there's little media coverage of it. We, at one point, we tried to tack on to a study that was being done of media coverage of political issues, of local news coverage generally. We asked after some surveys had come out showing, here's how much the county council gets covered compared to the sports and the weather, and then here's how much the Senate race gets covered. And we asked, okay, do you have stats on judicial elections? And they laughed at us. And I said, there are none. I mean, we get zero. We see no coverage whatsoever. And in addition, we have the fact, beyond this issue, that candidates for the bench themselves are constrained by canons of campaign conduct. If you're a judge, you have more constraints on your own campaign speech than does a legislative candidate. Most of that, getting back to the issue I mentioned a minute ago, you don't want a judge making an outright promise. As you can imagine, for particularly those of you in law school, it gets very complicated in a hurry between that very obvious situation where you don't promise a particular case in advance versus First Amendment rights of any candidate to say something on the campaign trail. Where do you draw a line in the middle? That, too, could be the subject of many classes. Let's just say that it's a factor in making these races less exciting. Judges, of course, cannot, at least ethically, offer favors. They cannot do constituent casework. They're often unknown, since sometimes they're just not as active as other types of politicians, so they're less likely maybe to have been out at the Rotary Club or somewhere else where the public would see them. And something else that those of you who may recall this may have noticed is that judicial races are quite typically relegated to the bottom of the ballot, which makes it even easier to skip over them, particularly if they get long. And Chicago has this enormous ballot where there's literally 100 judges at the bottom of the ballot. And if you voted on 5 or 6 big offices and you suddenly see 100 judges you've never heard of, if you can sort of guess what you might want to do, you can understand what a lot of other people do. Finally, in a few places, judicial elections occur at times that are bound to produce low turnout, like April in Wisconsin. There will be a Supreme Court race next spring, or this next month rather, or 2 months from now. August in Tennessee, or in some cases odd-numbered years, as is the case with Pennsylvania's spring primaries. And there were, I think, everybody had good reasons for setting it up this way. And typically, when you do this, you think that it'll get you away from, having court elections affected by other elections. It's a double-edged sword. It also means that fewer people will simply turn out for the election in the first place. So judicial elections really start with one hand tied behind their back. They just don't have as much going for them in terms of attracting people like you to the ballot box, even if you're good citizens. So therefore, I want to turn to the issue of sources of information for voters, because that was what you mentioned in the back as the one thing you didn't have. And that's what most people say. If I just simply had some more information, maybe I'd be more likely to vote. And let me just ask those of you who have voted for a judge, when you did vote for a judge, anybody remember the criteria they used or the information that they had in hand that made them vote for a particular judge, even if it was just one point of data? Mark.
Whether the candidate was the incumbent, which one
Okay.
was the incumbent, and whether I knew anything extremely negative about the incumbent.
Okay.
In other words, I was doing a retention election
Yeah.
calculation.
So incumbency was a good thing for you,
It was a good thing as
Okay.
long as they hadn't screwed up.
as long as they hadn't screwed up. Okay. Yes, sir.
Party identification.
Party identification. Others? So we've had 2 Qs here mentioned, or sort of 2.5 with the screw-up Q. Okay, so you've mentioned a couple of the big ones that are sometimes used. Candidates' ethnicity is often seen, and this is true of other elections as well, of course, but in particular when you have elections that people have no other way to make a decision, people start to search hard for other clues that may be out there. And in addition to the incumbency and perhaps party identification, ethnicity can play a role, gender. There are political science studies out there that show that actually, interestingly, that there are some number of voters who, if they have no other way to choose between two candidates, and one is a woman and one is a man, they will vote for a woman to give a woman a break, with the idea that women have not had as many chances, and that this is our chance to vote for women. There are no doubt people who do it the other way. That's not as officially well reported as well. Name, ID, if it's a well-known name, particularly in a political dynasty, it might be somebody you're more likely to vote for. Party affiliation, length of time on the bench, sometimes cited. Nobody has mentioned a voter guide. Let me just put this a different way. Anybody ever remember whether or not they used it, receiving any information about a judicial candidate in the mail? Is that how you got it in the mail, or?
Yeah, well, both in the mail and in a newspaper.
In a newspaper, okay. So a classic voter guide. Anybody see TV or hear radio ads about judicial elections? You have? Where are you from? West Virginia, okay. So you've had plenty. Voter guides we've mentioned. Anybody done their own research into judicial elections? I do this for a living. I live in Maryland, and a few years ago, I had no information whatsoever on judicial election. I felt like I have to vote in this. I tell other people to do this for a living, but I had no way to pick out. And I spent an hour and a half on the internet, and I barely came up with criteria. It was not easy. A lot of people talk about trusted sources, talking to lawyers, talking to people in the judicial system, perhaps other judges. So you see an electorate searching hungrily for clues if they're going to decide to vote in these elections, and then otherwise perhaps holding back if they don't get these clues. So thinking a little bit about these various sources of information, if you had it all at your fingertips, if it was easy to get to, what information would you want? I mean, and this has come up a little bit, but are there types of information that, in addition to incumbency and perhaps party, that if you just could have it all in front of you and be that great informed voter and somebody could just hand it to you, that you would want? Perhaps not. Perhaps you just want to roll off.
Reversal rates.
Reversal rates.
Sort
Okay.
of a report card from a higher court.
Mm-hmm. And that's actually, I'm sorry.
I would say experience. So
Experience.
Or judge.
Yeah. And was there another hand? Sir.
I was going to say their practice area and then what sort of court they're going to be sitting in.
Mm-hmm. And does anybody feel like these sources of information are very readily available? I'm guessing no from the way it's being described here. Let me then go to one of the handouts you had in your packet, which you may be wondering why I put this in there. You may have figured it out. These were election tallies from Harris County, Texas, which you may have flipped through. And what I noticed in them was this, the following percentages for candidates. These are in judicial races in Harris County, which is the county that Houston, Texas lies in. And see what you think about these numbers, what they have in common. 51.34, 51.51, 51.29. These are margins of the electorate that people got. 50.50, and then we go to a second section where the numbers include 51.31, 52.65, 51%, 50.74, 51.52, 51.73, 51.20. These numbers seem particularly spread out to you. This is a big county, and these are counties where, in many of these races, 1 million votes were cast. And these, for those of you who've done this, and I took a few statistics course, that wouldn't be much of a bell curve. That'd be pretty stuffed together. Any idea what all of these candidates had in common that got these rather exactly close percentages to each other? They were on the Democratic Party line. And in Harris County, Texas, this past year, you had 23 experienced Republican judges who were all turned out of office at the circuit court level for one reason. They happen to have an R next to their name. It was a D year in Harris County, and so 23 experienced judges are gone. 23 new judges are now in because they were Ds and their opponents were Rs. That is a pretty powerful clue for a lot of people who do this searching and wonder how they're going to vote. And let me just add as well that, going back to the examples of Chicago and also New York City, party ballot operations are obviously honed to a fine art. The word is machine. And in fact, in Chicago, you have a situation where the Democratic Cook County Democratic hold is so strong on politics generally, and particularly in the judiciary, that you essentially have a situation whereby the Democratic Party gets its judges on the bench, and even regardless of their competence afterwards has done a very good job of retaining them, to the point where neutral evaluations will sometimes say out of the 200 judges out there, there are maybe two. Everybody agrees should not be a judge. This person just was not cut out for it. All the lawyers agree. Here are the evaluations. They're objective. They're neutral. And the Chicago Tribune will valiantly try to raise this as an issue. No matter what you do, vote against these two judges. That typically knocks off about 4 or 5% off their votes. Otherwise, good Democratic voters are getting their hand grips when they walk in, and they are the ones who take those 100 ballots and go D, 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 D. And thus we have all the D judges. And in New York City as well. New York City's system of party conventions for picking the judicial nominees on the Democratic side was seen as such an insider game, I want to say Brooklyn actually, that this caused litigation, went to the U.S. Supreme Court called Lopez-Torres, arguing that it was not even a valid way of, that it was a sham in terms of picking a candidate. On the other hand, the lawsuit lost and the system remains as it was. I promised you television, and I will now deliver. We have my organization, in terms of looking at these voter queues and the information that voters actually get when deciding whether to vote and who to vote for, compiles television ads from around the country, and I have some selected ads that have run in the past decade in states around the country in Supreme Court races that will give you a flavor of what people see.
Ever wonder why families never get a fair shake from the Michigan Supreme Court?
Lucille, where are my judges?
Just where they've always been, right in your pocket.
Just follow the money. Justices Markman, Taylor, and Young have been given hundreds of thousands by insurance companies and big business. They have the money, but you have the voice. Justice should not be for sale.
Hey, Al, what we gonna do with all these defective baby carriers? Sell them to the third world?
No, we're gonna ship them to Michigan. The Supreme Court makes it almost impossible for anyone to sue us if one of their kids gets hurt by one of these, even if we know they're dangerous.
Gee, that ain't right. Glad I don't live there.
Michigan Supreme Court only protects big business and their insurance companies. No Markman, no Taylor, no Young. Justice should not be for sale.
Is justice for sale in Ohio? You decide. Since 1994, Justice Alice Resnick has taken more than $750,000 from personal injury lawyers. Justice Resnick ruled in favor of trial lawyers who had contributed to her campaign nearly 70% of the time. After a union leader and big contributor complained about a ruling Resnick made, Resnick became the only justice to reverse herself in the case. Alice Resnick, is justice for sale?
Children into the house. Once inside, the 3 children were sexually molested. A 4-year-old girl raped. Her brothers sodomized her. A Belleville man was arrested and convicted of the crime after trying to develop pictures of the abuse. Despite prosecutors' objections, Judge Lloyd Carmeier gave him probation, saying the court should grant leniency. Another case where Carmeier let a violent criminal out into the community. Lloyd Carmeier, the wrong choice for Supreme Court.
Molested multiple West Virginia children, one only 4 years old. For this terrible crime, Tony Dean Arbaugh was sentenced to serve 15 to 35 years. But just 3 years later, a shocking turn of events, liberal Judge Warren McGraw cast the deciding vote to set this reprehensible criminal free. On Election Day, you can't undo the crime that happened to these children, but you can make sure that Judge Warren McGraw never does his part again.
He was adorable. Stevie had just turned 3 years old before he was beaten and tortured to death. The Anders decision let my son's killer walk free after serving less than a third of his murder sentence. You could have a convicted murderer released on the Anders decision next door, and you wouldn't even know it. If Justice Alexander hadn't voted for this decision, this wouldn't have happened. Judge Alexander is way out of touch with this issue. I'm here supporting John Groen, because John Groen is for victims and their families.
Justice for sale? John Groen and far-right extremists are trying to buy our Supreme Court.
So extreme, they want to gut protections for our clean air and water. They oppose stem cell research and a woman's right to choose. Special interests skirting campaign finance laws, bankrolling John Groen. Keep our courts fair and impartial. Vote for Gary Alexander. Join law enforcement, prosecutors, and all major newspapers. Vote for Gary Alexander. Protect our constitutional rights.
Alabama's greedy trial lawyers spend big bucks opposing our conservative values. Take the case of Judge Tom Parker. Parker accepted more than $250,000 from liberal trial lawyers. Then he tried to conceal it. The trial lawyer's liberal agenda helps to drive up the costs of goods and services and erodes our family values. Learn more about Tom Parker and his ties to liberal trial lawyers.
9 years ago, a vicious thug raped and repeatedly stabbed a pregnant woman, leaving her and her unborn child to die. Convicted of rape and murder, Ronaldo Adams was sentenced to death. But now, Adams is off death row thanks to Chief Justice Drayton Nabors in the Alabama Supreme Court, using a 5-4 decision based on foreign law and unratified UN treaties.
Alabama's courts need to stand up for American law, not foreign law. Some things are worth fighting for.
Tom Parker for Chief Justice. Fair, balanced, unafraid.
You feel educated? I don't mean to be too rhetorical about that. Are there ads within that you felt like gave you useful information if you're that voter trying to figure out who to vote for? You're nodding your head yes. So what was an example that's sticking in your mind now?
The Jerry Alexander ad, which was kind of the political views of his opponent. I thought that was actually useful.
Sir.
Well, this goes to your suggestion that it's a bad system for it to be insider baseball. I found that kind of paradoxical, because the one thing I really want to know about is judicial quality. And I would think, the only time we've had any high-quality elections is when people sort of deferred to lawyers who knew, could evaluate that. And so to my mind, the most useful thing in those ads is where they gave the views of the establishment newspapers.
Interesting. Okay. So endorsements in that case matter.
I don't trust the word that was said.
So you're looking for quality.
The fact that people who might have looked into it,
yeah,
opinion was of some value. I don't understand the idea that it shouldn't be insider based.
And the media in particular could at least play that role in connecting to that value of quality.
Media that does some investigation, or
yeah,
a bar association that's been involved in elections before, that can be helpful. Because, lawyers sometimes agree on who a bad judge is, at least.
Yeah. Other thoughts or reactions to the ads? Yes, sir.
I thought it was interesting that in at least one or two of the ads, they highlighted the fact that the judge signed on to a 5-4 opinion. And to me, that just kind of says, like, well, there's 4 other people that supported his position. You can't, it's not like he was 1 out of, 9. And it just, I don't know why they would choose to highlight that fact when they're trying to say that he's so crazy he had 4 supporters.
Anybody have an answer for that?
I would say that he's the judge going up for re-election that year, so they appoint him, which, that's just not that accurate.
Just to say, like, he supported this side is more convincing than to say he and 4 others supported this side.
Well, in fact, I would note that judges have been run against when they were sometimes part of 8-1 decisions, and they were 1 of 8, and nonetheless, if the decision sounds bad, you get tarred with it. Did you have a hand up as well?
Oh yeah, I was going to say, and I wonder also, how much the average voter knows about, appellate decisions and how, how many judges vote and sign on and what that actually means if you hear that. For us for most of us as law students, and I think everyone else understands it, at least at this point in this class, what that means, but, for the average voter, I don't think that would, stand out to them. Like, for us, saying, oh, you signed on to a majority opinion that maybe wasn't popular, why are you getting, caught as, like, the bad guy? But I think for a lot of people, that this guy, supported this decision. He was the pivotal, deciding vote. But, so I think that's the way that it's framed really for the average voter, it would mean a lot more.
Yes, ma'am.
I think the thing that's most striking about these ads for me is that they're so undignified and lowbrow for a position that's seemingly a position of dignity where you want to project a certain image. And it's, I don't know, if I were a candidate, I would try to avoid anything that looked anything like that because I wouldn't want that sort of thing associated with my name.
So why do you think they do it?
Well, the fear value, the shock value, but still, I don't.
Yeah. Other reactions?
I was going to say, I think that the viewers who watch those types of things want to see that these judges are in touch with what's important to them. And while I thought that a lot of those are ridiculous, you know, I think that that's what people are trying to come across. And even though you if you were running, may not want to put those types of things out, you got to understand that the viewers who are watching these expect that type of thing. You know, here's the views of the candidate, and you know, even though they're ridiculous, that's what they expect, and there's a good chance you'd lose in that case. I think the video we were supposed to watch for today, the one judge she said that she ended up winning the retention. She said that she wouldn't speak out about it. It was what was
Penny White.
Penny White. She said I didn't want to speak out about how things were because I didn't think I should. But then again, she didn't get reelected or reappointed or re-put back in because she didn't say anything. You know, and
Other thoughts? Yes, ma'am.
I was just wondering what the statistics were to back up if your organization has done studies about when these negative ads are on TV as opposed to like no negative ads at all. Does it skew the results of the election?
You know, as a general matter, what we know is we know more about how much has been spent on the ads, and so since 1999, more than $35 million has been spent on them. And for judicial races, that's a lot. That may not seem a lot by what just went on in the presidential election, but that's pretty huge. And there was an explosion around that year. And in addition to the candidates raising the money for those ads, you have another at least $16 million and maybe far more that have been put in by interest groups on their own independent ads. And in fact, some of what you saw a mix of candidate ads and independent expenditures here, and a lot of it is these rival camps. Business against labor and plaintiffs against business and pro-development against pro-conservation groups. I don't have as much information on the specific linkage between turnout and judicial elections. I think that the question of I was actually going to pose this question as to whether the group here, whether you would have been more likely to turn out having seen ads like this. If these were the ads you saw, and let's pretend they were about 2 candidates versus 8 or 9 on either side, how many people here feel like they'd be more likely to go ahead and vote in a judicial election than they were if they didn't exist? 1 hand, 2, 3, 4. So a scattering of hands. Some people feel more likely. Anybody feel less likely to vote in the election? A few hands there, maybe about the same number, and I'm assuming the rest of you are doesn't necessarily change you too much one way or the other. And let me ask you those, if for the people who didn't think they would turn out, or maybe be less likely to turn out because of them, and to go back to you, because you were making this point, if you see other people who do turn out because of them, do you think, is that a good thing? It sort of repelled you, but if it propelled others, does that bother you, or?
I'm never opposed to people voting.
Yeah. Okay. So it got into the polls.
What they believe in.
Other reactions, sir?
I have a reaction to the ads that they're appealing to the gullibility of a certain element of the voter. And I look at these ads as just trying to reach to the bottom of the poll and fishing out those voters and hoping they'll vote for me through that gullibility factor.
Other thoughts? Sir?
I mean, I think that with the ads, I think that especially the sort of fiery ads that you have on here, incendiary ads, that it's going to encourage additional media exposure. Maybe newspapers are going to write more about it. There's going to be additional coverage. And I think that's what would attract me to voting in those types of elections more. Not so much that the ads are going to affect me one way or the other, but there's going to be additional coverage. There's going to be a lot more information that you can gather from it.
So the ad might not do it on its own, but it drives more coverage, and the coverage might get you there, because the coverage would hopefully include good information that you want to use. Let me mention an ad that I did not show, and it's one we have. That disc doesn't work. It's one from this past year, and it's from the state of Michigan. And in fact, if you remember the first two ads from Michigan, Markman and Taylor and Young, Chief Justice Markman, who won that race 8 years ago, despite the targeting, was up for re-election this year. And one of the main ads run against him was an accusation by a litigant that he had fallen asleep during a case, and the accusation was made by an attorney who, I'll at least say that there's been a strong argument made that that allegation may not have been true. Justice Markman lost his position this year as Chief Justice of the state of Michigan. A lot of people believe that that ad was the cut-through value. If the ad was a lie and it defeated him, does that change in the way anybody feels about this issue of ads and court races in particular? Is that just part of politics? Do you hold a different standard for how this affects a judicial race than a legislative race? Any thoughts?
It makes me wish or hope that the Michigan journalists fact-checked that and reported what was really the case, whatever the case was, and that people would rely on that rather than on propaganda, but it doesn't sound like that.
I think, to be fair, it was in the realm of, he said, and that you had the allegation and you had people saying it didn't happen and there was no way to conclusively prove it. Maybe one more case for cameras in the courtroom so that you could know for sure. I also, I'm sure no student has ever nodded off during a class. I don't know whether from a professional standpoint it would be a very fair thing to do to look for one moment in a judge's career where they might have actually closed their eyes but hearing an argument. But in any event, that is what happened. One other point I want to make about these ads is that, as you kind of saw here, is that they're very heavily skewed towards crime issues. The work of courts is very broad and includes crime issues, but many, many other issues. As you might imagine, if you watch these ads, you get a pretty steady diet of the worst, most horrific crimes, and then the attempts to link the judges to a decision that is seen as the wrong way. And that goes both ways. You've actually seen a package of ads that we very carefully balance between ads on behalf of Democratic campaigns and Republican candidates, and both sides use it equally. It's pretty much seen as the cut-through issue. You saw a couple tort ads in the beginning, references to tort liability. I don't think we see as many of those anymore. I think it's pretty well established that the high cut-through value with these ads is crime issues, and presumably we'll just see many more for years to come. One other thing I want to mention here is that what judges have to do to pay for them, not surprisingly, we have to raise money. And one of the issues that we face today with judicial elections is indeed the impact of having judges dial for dollars to raise the big money, particularly if you're in a state like Ohio, which has more major media markets than any other state in the nation, I believe 8, and to get on all 8 of them, you have to raise a lot of money. And finally, this set of ads in this discussion gets to a topic I want to at least mention, and we can come back in discussion just because it's very topical. There is indeed a Supreme Court argument next week coming out of the state of West Virginia, and if you remember the West Virginia ad against a particular judge, the judge who replaced him, Justice Benjamin, is himself now has a case before the Supreme Court as to the fact that with the ads that were run on his behalf, we didn't see one of those, but there were about $3 million of ads run on his behalf by a particular business executive. He was one of 3 justices in a one-vote case who decided to overturn a big jury verdict against that energy executive after he was elected. He was asked to recuse himself by the other business that was part of the litigation. He declined to do so. That's going to be in front of the Supreme Court next week. This is an area that's very hot for us right now. I'd encourage you all to keep an eye on the coverage. We certainly have plenty of stuff on our website, but hopefully the media will be doing a good job of covering it as well. So I then wanted to get to the issue of, we've established that turnout is pretty low here, and I want to talk a little bit more about the costs of this low turnout. And there's an obvious one, which is bad civics. It's always just worse, period, if fewer people participate. I think everybody would at least generally disagree with that, though we had one.
I might disagree.
You might disagree with that too.
Yeah,
okay,
it seems to me that there was a time when we had pretty responsible judicial elections.
Yeah.
The reason is because nobody but lawyers voted. People actually knew what the court did. And as soon as you have broad participation, people are doing things like voting on whether you set a criminal free, which is a disaster, because of course you should set them free, because you don't know if they're criminal unless the trial is fair. And so when judges vote to set somebody accused criminal free, it's usually because they felt the trial wasn't fair and want them to decide that on the merits. So this is a disaster, this broad participation.
Okay, so the case has been made here that better participation is a bad thing. I think the word is disaster. Other comments about the issue of, trying to raise turnout? Let me put it a different way. What about the idea of raising turnout amongst people who have taken a time to become well-informed? Does that sound better to people? And what do the TV ads represent in that regard? We've sort of heard this before, but I'm hearing, I think, a mix in that regard as to whether it helps people enough. I have mentioned as well that one of the aspects of these ads, of the judicial election scene we see is that with low turnout, there's some interesting political things that happen, and you have now, as a result of fewer people involved, the judges themselves, when they are going to spend their time with somebody on the campaign trail, you can sort of imagine who they spend their time with if they have a certain amount of discretionary time, and that is the donors. Because they're under great pressure to raise money, to outraise the other candidate, to get their ads on the air. We hear plenty of reports of judges who have to spend a lot of time talking to donors and not to voters when they are elected officials. In addition, I think it's also the case that these low turnout elections create a vacuum. If you think about what happens in an election where a small number of people vote, that's an easier election to tip. If you are an interest group and can turn out your base, you're far more likely to turn out enough people who said, I like that ad because of X or Y or Z, that judge ought to be voted in or voted out. And the argument we make is, we call it sort of a supply side argument in the sense of if more voters from all sides simply voted, we actually have somewhat more faith that this would be a better thing. We obviously want that to be an informed vote. One other cost of low turnout is the possibility also that somebody who just shouldn't be on the bench at all may get through because of just normal campaign politics. And a couple examples that I think are in the reading you have is that in 1976, a candidate named Don Yarborough, for those of you who know Texas politics, defeated a well-respected judge with 17 years of service, in large part because that's a big name in Texas politics. And he was indicted for perjury and forgery shortly thereafter, had to resign a year after taking the bench. Similarly, in Illinois, of all states, a circuit court of Cook County judge was elected even after it was disclosed in federal court that he had already been implicated in corrupt payments to judges in the same county. His name was not Blagojevich, but nonetheless, he gained the bench. In Minnesota, a fresh law school graduate, this might be an idea for some of you, with an arrest record for domestic violence, received over 100,000 votes for district court judge, even though he ran against a highly qualified and respected opponent. I have a friend in Chicago who has mused with the last name of Doyle, maybe I should run for judge. This is a good name for Irish Catholic politics in the city of Chicago. And I would say as well, I mentioned the Harris County results with the sweep. We saw the same thing in Dallas County, 2006. Another couple dozen Dallas Republican judges were swept out because it was a Democratic year. And we've seen the opposite. In 1994, which was a very Republican year, a lot of Democratic judges were swept out simply on a party line vote. So, regardless of exactly how you define the problem, and whether or not you think that low turnout on its own, or maybe low turnout on the part of voters who don't have as much information is a bad thing, I want to sort of turn to a discussion finally of what can be done and what would make this interesting. And I want to kind of have you all, particularly the media side, wear your media hats and think about ways to improve turnout, at least amongst the people you want to improve turnout with, and educate voters. And I mentioned something that people said they hadn't really gotten, which is a voter guide. And let's pretend a voter guide arrives in your mailbox, that you actually get one. What do you want to be in it? Can someone name the first thing they want to see if they're going to decide on voting between Judge X and Judge Y? Or the second thing they want to see?
I
I always just, first I just want to see who's the incumbent.
Incumbent, okay. Incumbent, anything else? Yes,
Education, experience, what they did before they were a judge.
what they did before, yep. Endorsements, gives you that cue as to who's with them. Statement from the judge, is that of value from the candidate? Yep. Anything else? What about statements about how they'll decide cases?
Just their contributors, who's funding their campaign.
They're contributors, okay. And what about statements about how they'll decide cases? One head nodding sort of no, another head nodding no.
I would rather not see that. I would
Rather not see that.
Anything other than, I will follow the law and that, governs the case.
Mm-hmm. So let me ask if, hopefully you had a chance to look through a couple of the items I tossed in here, which were indeed voter guides from the state of Alabama from the 2008 election between Deborah Bell Passeur and Greg Shaw. If anybody had a chance to look at them, anything jump out as things you liked or thought would be useful to you? Perhaps some of these items? What you'll see here is you have that mix of the background, the family, education, bar admission, and then you have 3 or 4 questions. Let me just read them out. How have your training, professional experience, and interest prepared you to serve on the Alabama Supreme Court? What do you consider to be the 3 most important attributes of a judge? What is your judicial philosophy? How do you define judicial independence? And how important is it to our judicial system? What is the greatest area of need in the Alabama justice system? What part, if any, should public opinion play in the decision of a judge? And in a case before the court, how should a judge handle a conflict between his or her personal beliefs in the law? Do those sound like pretty good questions? Questions maybe you feel like missing? Maybe not.
I just think they would yield, unless you have a really partisan, crazy candidate who will say anything, you're going to get sort of bland, God bless America answers.
I think that's right. I disagree because I think, people might try to do that, but I feel like I would learn from those answers even if they were contrived.
What would you learn?
Well, I think one of the things I might learn is that this looks to me like a contrived answer. Somebody's trying too hard. Somebody writes, I believe in, God, the flag, and the American way.
Mm-hmm.
All right, I'm probably not voting for that person because that's not a thoughtful answer that addresses the question. So I get information from that. I feel like
You're reading between the lines.
Yeah, exactly.
I think you had your hand and then back there and then Keith.
I was going to say, when I looked at them the first time, I saw that there was the Republican candidate and the Democratic candidate, I think. And my assumption going in was that the Republican candidate would have a originalist type judicial philosophy and the Democratic candidate would have a living constitution type philosophy. And it was actually surprising to me when I read what is your judicial philosophy that, at least for some of them, both of the party candidates said, I believe in strict interpretation, I believe that we should follow what the law says and maybe not what is best for society at that time. And that was something that it made me think, okay, maybe I should look closer at the candidates than just Republican and Democrat. No, maybe the Democrat doesn't stand for what I think Democrats generally stand for. And so I think it actually did provide, it sort of broke the stereotype that I might have had when I was looking at it.
Mm-hmm. And, so you had your hand up, then we'll go to some others.
Well, it just reminds me when Justice C spoke earlier this year, he talked about how it's the job or the duty of the citizenry to elect the judges that have a specific judicial philosophy. So I like that question, and I think as much as I don't like partisan elections, he made the good point is that we as a citizenry should be able to choose what kind of judicial philosophies we have in our judges. So I like that question, and Kyle just reinforced it by saying that there's a little bit of a nuance. It's not so much party line. So I would say that you could learn something from those questions, whether reading in between the lines or looking at the actual answer and deciding that, yes, I like the way this judge will approach these cases, or I don't. And not even on an issue basis, but just in a jurisprudence way.
Keith, you had something.
I thought it was interesting in that actual example, as you move down the ballot and get to the lower court judges, they become less careful in their answers. And so the Supreme Court justices, they kind of converge, and as Kyle's observed, they say very similar things about judicial philosophy. You get further down, I think one of the candidates says, my reading of the Constitution doesn't stop with the Second Amendment. So, I mean, that's not a particularly subtle way, right? And so, I mean, I think there are ways in which the questions can be answered that are more revealing of someone just honestly giving a judicial philosophy that sounds a lot like a political philosophy, and other candidates who seem to have maybe advisors who are saying, no, this is what will constitute an acceptable philosophy, and so everybody can say, I'm going to follow the law as written. That's not much of a constraint necessarily. So,
yeah, I kind of expected what Keith would say, that you get some contests where there's pretty unrevealing, others where it was revealing. These people, they have their views, they don't realize how out there they are. But to me, this suffers from the same problem as elections generally. There's too much emphasis on what people say and not enough on what they've done. And so, for example, when I applied for clerkship, I was going to clerk in the state, my girlfriend, so I asked the people in the state bar who the good judges were. There's a real consensus about that, and actually there are published reviews where a lot of judges have said, a lot of lawyers have said, this person gets it right. They always understand your arguments. I mean, there's stuff like that that's out there. There's real information. And to me, the relative value, and I said the same thing about politicians, I don't really care what they say in elections. I want to know, what do they vote for in their previous offices? And, media emphasis on what people say as opposed to what they do is a huge problem. It's even huger in judicial elections.
Let me use this as a transition to my next kind of sub-point within this, which is, let me talk about a different source of information. I just read aloud from a League of Women Voters Guide, and they obviously work very hard to be careful and to kind of do it the right way, and to be careful not to ask questions that they think would lead too much one way or the other. Think about a questionnaire that's actually submitted to a candidate and then published on the internet by a group that has very strong viewpoints. And let's say it's there to educate its members who believe very strongly in those same viewpoints. So I will read aloud from one that I think you may have in your materials, and then also reverse it for you. So you have the questionnaire of Indiana Right to Life, which asked the judges in its state to agree or disagree with the following statement. I believe that abortion should be permitted only to prevent the death of the mother. I believe that abortion should be permitted only to prevent the mother's death in cases of incest and reported cases of forcible rape. I believe that Roe v. Wade was wrongly decided. Now, before we get to that, imagine those questions reversed. I believe that Roe v. Wade was rightly decided. I believe that it should be permitted in certain situations. So let's not get hung up on the particular point of view. Think about the issue and the request made of the judge. And let me ask the same question. Is this a valuable source of information? Are there risks that outweigh the value? Is it a good thing?
I think that just an answer to that question shows a lot about how the judge interprets the law. Roe v. Wade or Planned Parenthood v. Casey are both indicate, depending on which way you go as a judge, the way you're going to interpret the law in general and the Constitution. And that's an application to people. So, yeah, I think it is a valuable source of, not just because of the specifics, but it does show underlying ideologies of the judge.
And Roe v. Wade, of course, we're referring to a past tense case. It's been decided already. It's not going to come before them. Sir.
I was saying, I think it's more of like a loaded, just political question that's put on there that voters might just see the response to either yes or no, and that's what they'll stop. They don't. A lot of voters, they won't care about, blah blah blah, your philosophy or whatever in that circumstance. They'll just say, oh, he thinks he's for abortion, and that's all they'll get out of it. And so I think it might contribute towards more uninformed voters not really getting the whole story behind judges. I mean, I think that there is the possibility that you could derive their judicial philosophy from things like that, but I think most people will just take it as just kind of like a short political trick.
Anybody agree or disagree with that? Does anybody have, if you had that judicial election in front of you, anybody think of groups they would just want to go to their website and see if they had a questionnaire for the judge? One nodding yes. If you were a judge, would you want to answer those questions? Judicial candidate? I'm seeing one nodding of no, a couple nods of no. And let me, I mentioned the Roe v. Wade example. Again, that is a case that has happened. You can obviously comment on something another judge has done in the past. In this context, does it change your thinking at all if it's a case that the judge may yet hear? let's say there's a new, well, you could say abortion case on, let's say your state doesn't deal with a right to abortion in the case of situation where the mother might be in physical danger, let's say. If that case has yet to be heard, does that make this calculation different? One no, I think. Why not?
I think that if you're going to say that, if you were going to say it in one instance, like there could always be another case that comes up before you. So if you're going to go down that road, you're going down.
So it doesn't really make a difference. And so, since you're in the position of thinking this is generally a good thing to have this information there, what do you say if I'm a litigant and I go before that judge who was elected because of that standpoint, and I want somebody who hasn't made up their mind yet?
I guess I would say, you're saying that the judge already
publicly
spoke about.
Let's say they answered the questionnaire and they said yes or no, depending on what you like. Is that a concern to the litigants who might come up for them? Yes. Okay. So this is a Rubik's Cube, isn't it? Another source of information that has been, I think, referred to, at least implicitly here, performance evaluations. And I think, I actually forget whether we put an example in your materials, and I think last year you had somebody come from a group in Denver that works very hard on this issue. But essentially, I think right now, nearly 20 states have these programs where city judges are periodically evaluated on their performance on the bench. And a number of other states have unofficial evaluations. And these are surveys by people who interact with a judge on a regular basis. So in the case of Alaska, you have members of the bar, probation officers, social workers, guardians, court-appointed special advocates, the people who deal with the judges, and then you can ask them to then evaluate the judge in a number of areas of performance: legal ability, impartiality, integrity, temperament, diligence, special skills, respect for the parties, attorneys and staff, promptness, and overall performance. When you hear that list, does that sound interesting to anybody here? You're very interested in that. Anybody else interested? Absolutely. You are. Anybody find that not particularly interesting?
Some of those things mean a lot less to me
Yeah.
than others.
And so if you had
sort of on the same plane.
Mm-hmm. And if you sort of had a choice between that and the questionnaire on Roe v. Wade?
Well, I hate those. I don't think.
You don't like those, okay. So what would you like ideally then to make up your mind?
Well, I like the kind of questionnaires that Mark doesn't like because especially one thing I wanted to make a point about that was not, what I liked about that questionnaire was that it asked about, 8 or 9 questions. Judicial philosophy, it was a number of different things. And I think one of the ways that you can get a lot of information is by reading the answers to each of those questions as opposed to any one of those questions by itself. So I liked the fact that there were a number of different questions. But I mean, I just react when I hear promptness and the way he treats the litigants. That kind of stuff. To me, that is not as valuable information as, say, education, experience. And so my reaction is to the fact that those things are, I don't know whether they're evaluated and put on the same footing, but, it troubles me that's, to the extent that kind of question suggests to the voters that those are things that should matter as much as other things. So you like the legal and voters model. So let me ask you sort of as a summing up question here for anybody, and hopefully more than one of you. Pretend that you are the executive editor of the Daily Planet, and that your owner has just called you and said, "This is terrible. There's not enough turnout in judicial elections. People want more information. I want you to give it to them." What do you do, having thought through all these topics? Anybody want to start by being editor? Start with one thing, Editor Obi?
I be that reporter many times in Harris County, Texas, as a matter of fact.
Is that right?
And so my revulsion over those questionnaires is because every time as a reporter I would go to judicial candidates and ask questions, I would get back this pablum about following the law, and they all sounded alike. And so it's without either anonymous lawyer evaluations of the judge's performance or judicial performance evaluation report, without any I would want those sorts of qualitative judgments about whether the judge does his job.
And so you're the editor, and the only demand that's been made of you is you do something. And you don't have these resources at your fingertips, so you're just the media person. What do? You have a budget, so you can
Call lawyers.
pretend.
Call lots of lawyers.
Call lawyers.
And promise them anonymity because they won't tell the truth with their name attached.
And then you write stories saying that anonymous lawyers said X?
Yes, uncomfortably, but yes, because it'd be better than nothing.
And that is better than nothing in your viewpoint?
If I got enough of them and I trusted that they weren't trying to throw a slider, yeah.
Other executive editors in the room here? Or legal counsel to executive editors?
I would try to separate the judicial performance issues from the politics. And I still would want to know, like, if the judge candidate is a member of the Sierra Club or, his or her affiliations, I would want to know that as a voter. But I would put less weight on that as some of the things that we were just talking about, the performance elements. So it's one of the, like, a two-tiered thing. Be able to just express your politics, but also get to some of the performance.
So performance and politics, but separate
I don't think we should hide, if we're going to be electing judges, we shouldn't hide the politics.
Other ways at this?
Well, I'd like to do performance evaluations, if there's no guide like that calling people, but I want to supplement that by trying to get lawyers to come on a couple of really hard cases that are really revealing their judicial philosophy.
So to get the lawyers to comment on the judges?
Yeah, I think I'd sort of like a combination of these self-reporting questions, something, but even better, if you really want to know how they're going to decide things for the law. A, are they good? And it's easier to assess if a person has a record. Right? Some of these people are new, and that's hard. You really have to go on something because they might not have really good evaluations. Some you will be incumbents, but not new people. And if you happen to have the good fortune of two good incumbents running against each other, a higher spot in the judicial system or something like that, a philosophy would become really important.
Did you have your hand up as well?
I did. I was going to say, I like the idea of having sort of a survey of lawyers that, because I think that can give a lot of information that the justice would never reveal about himself. It's going to give sort of an understanding of the day-to-day dealings with the judge. But I would like also to have the sort of League of Women Voters questions answered by the judges. Because I think the combination of the two just gives you so much information and really will sort of allow you to, because there's always going to be attorneys that just don't like a judge, or they just don't get along. Mm-hmm. And there's always going to be judges that sort of pat themselves on the back. So maybe to have like the combination, that's going to give you the most full picture, and I think maybe even just a statistical analysis of the lawyers' answers, and then having the judges provide answers themselves, it would be an easy way to do it.
So I think we're hearing generally that this is not easy, if you're a voter, that therefore, a lot of people opt out, that if you want to be conscientious, several people have referred to combinations of information. How likely are you to go and look for such a combination of information as opposed to if you have it delivered to you? As a final question here. Anybody feel like now going out and spending an hour and a half before election night looking? This is the only thing I would say in closing, is that in addition to all these issues of what it is that voters may want, the issue of delivery, which is mechanics in many ways, is hugely important. And in fact, North Carolina, which adopted a number of reforms to judicial selection a few years ago, adopted a state-sponsored voter guide, and it gets mailed to every household. And we've actually sponsored focus groups where people seem pretty pleased with that outcome. And I would just sort of commend to your attention, for anybody who looks at this topic at all in any greater depth, the issue of how people even get this, if you built the best mechanism, what it means in a crowded internet age to actually get information to people. With that said, I would just not only thank you for your attention, but for your questions and for your ideas, because you have frankly engaged in one of the best discussions I've seen of a very tough topic, and I intentionally brought this one forward because it's one of the toughest ones we dealt with, and I'm not sitting on any easy answers that, are waiting on this last page here. It is as tough as we describe, and in some ways tougher. And I just hope that whatever careers you're at and go into, that you'll keep at it, and there are going to be chances to make it better, and I hope you'll be part of it. Thank you very much.